All right, so thank you for having me today. As Patrick said, my name is Christina. I'm a faculty member at North Carolina State in the Department of Crop and Soil Science. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some of the research we do with our North Carolina DOT on using compost and wildflowers to improve our soils after construction. I do want to put a note out there. I am a soil scientist, so you may be familiar with some of the issues I talk about, but I do come from them from a different perspective, being a soil scientist. So I just want to give a broad overview of one of the reasons why we work with our DOT, and that's simply because North Carolina has one of the largest highway systems in the nation. They're responsible for managing over 80,000 miles of highway, which means they have lots of room to improve their soils next to their roadside, and also lots of ways that they can be a leader in the nation in terms of improving their best management practices for everyone. So one of the reasons we work with them is simply because we as researchers can do the research for them to see if the practices they have are truly the best practices out there for them to be implementing across the state. Construction involves a lot of heavy equipment that compacts the soil, leading to reduced infiltration and increased surface runoff. The stripping of topsoil and vegetation is another problem we have with roadway construction, and it leads to erosion and reduced water quality in the future. Also, the stripping of topsoil and compaction makes it really hard for vegetation to grow after construction. And this also then will lead to long-term aesthetic and loss of habitat for pollinators. So one potential solution out there is to do compost incorporation or filling compost into our roadside soils. Compost incorporation has the potential to increase our soil's infiltration rate, which is how fast water can move through the soil. It also has the potential to increase water retention, which is the water that is available for plants to use. It can improve vegetation establishment, as compost can serve as a nutrient source, and it may lead to the reduction of synthetic fertilizer application in the future. And then lastly, it's a low-cost alternative to built stormwater structures such as detention basins and swales that require continual maintenance. Also, because our 5-year storm is now becoming our 1-year storm, the DOT is looking for low-impact development solutions where we can just reduce the amount of water going into our built stormwater structures. So what we are looking to do here is to have a one-time compost application we incorporate into roadside soils and walk away from, yet its benefits will last years down the road for stormwater management. Another low maintenance option we have is to plant wildflowers over traditional grass blends. Wildflowers have the potential to increase infiltration rate. The question mark is because the literature is pretty split on if you see increases in infiltration or not. But none of the research has been done in North Carolina, so we are curious how our North Carolina soils will react with infiltration and wildflowers. Also, wildflowers provide pollinator habitat, so we do get the environmental benefit, which the DOT is continuously looking for other ways to get environmental credit. Also, it fits in with our DOT's highway beautification project, and it's also just more aesthetically pleasing to look at flowers when you drive versus grass. Lastly, there's many other environmental benefits such as soil and air quality that wildflowers can provide. What we are looking to do here is to plant wildflowers over traditional grass blends and still get good vegetation cover and also have it be a stormwater management practice. So now I'm going to go over a slew of different field experiments we've done and kind of conclude with some of the recommendations we've been giving the DOT about compost and wildflowers. So this first study is the first study that kicked it off about using compost in our roadside soils. And our objective was to determine bulk density and infiltration rate of our different treatments. So for this experiment, we had a simulated construction site where we compacted the soil. We had a tilled treatment where we tilled the soil to 12 inches. We had a tilled and compacted treatment where we tilled the soil to 12 inches. And then incorporate compost at 25% by volume. And then we had a core aeration treatment where we used a core aerator to take little plugs of soil out. So this is the experimental setup, and this is consistent through all the field experiments that we did. The first thing we did is we had to simulate our construction site. So we came in with a bulldozer to remove any kind of existing vegetation and topsoil. Then we had a soil compactor come over and drive over it to simulate that heavy equipment. Then we came in with a backhoe to break up the soil. And then lastly, we used a rotary tiller and hand tools to mix in any kind of amendments to our plots. What is core aeration? So for those of us who aren't familiar, core aeration is a machine that pulls plugs of soil out of the ground, and it's commonly used in managed turf settings. And it's known to increase water flow, nutrients, and oxygen to the plant roots. So we are curious if in roadside soils, if we plant grass, would this core aeration treatment work the same way it does on a golf course? So one of the reasons we included this is because core aeration has not traditionally been used in areas of construction. They're more in highly managed turf settings. I'm also just going to briefly go over the compost we use because compost can be a source of variation in results. We went to the same commercial compost vendor year after year to get the compost to kind of cut out any kind of variation. We also chose a vendor that the DOT was going to be able to source in the mountains and in the coastal plain region. So we had a blend of agricultural byproducts, woody material, yard waste, and food waste, and then they screened it to a finer texture to kind of resemble soil. So for the properties we measured bulk density. There's a student here, and what we did is we simply hammer a core into the ground. Then we pull it out. We can take it back to the lab and dry it to get a density. We choose to measure density simply because we want to know if our soils are being compacted or they're getting decompacted with the treatments we put in. We also monitor infiltration rate because if this is a stormwater management practice, we want to know how much runoff volume we can attenuate with this. We used a single ring infiltrometer. So how that works is we simply hammer a core into the ground, pond water to a known head, and then we just measure how fast water moves through it till we hit a constant rate. So now I'm going to get into the results from this first experiment. So each number has letters after it. Those are letters of significant difference. So if the letters are the same, they are statistically the same. If the letters are different, then the numbers are statistically different. One of the pros of doing research at a research station is we can replicate each treatment and get a variation in the practices that we have, so we know what to expect when we put it on the roadside. When we looked at our treatments for bulk density, our compacted and our core aeration treatment have the highest bulk density, but they are also not different from each other. Then we get a significant reduction in bulk density with tilled and tilled plus compost. Here, we didn't get a benefit of an additional reduction in bulk density with the compost, but it does seem tilling the soil can significantly reduce your bulk density. Moving on to infiltration in inches per hour, we see that our compacted and our core aeration treatment have the slowest infiltration at less than 1 inch per hour. And then we get a benefit of tilling the soil and having tilled plus compost for our infiltration rate. So it is significantly higher, but again, we don't get another benefit from adding that compost with the tilling. We also measured grass cover. The DOT has a requirement where they have to have 70% vegetation cover in order for them to stop monitoring that area. So at the end of our experiment, we just took a visual assessment of our grass cover. Not surprisingly, the compacted and the core aeration treatment had the same vegetation cover, but our tilled treatment was significantly higher. We were unfortunately unable to get data for our till plus compost treatment, so we can't really say anything about compost as being a nutrient source in this case. And then lastly, we're going to do our biomass. So for biomass, we just go there and we cut the grass right at the soil surface, take it back to the lab and dry it, and then just another way to measure how much vegetation is out there. Not surprisingly, our compacted and our core aeration treatment have the exact same biomass, and it is significantly reduced compared to our tilled treatment. So one of the conclusions we made from this study is that core aeration really doesn't work in this highly compacted system. It didn't decrease our bulk density. It didn't give us more infiltration. We didn't get better grass growth. So for us, this might work in a highly managed turf setting, but when you already have compacted soil, pulling a little plug of soil out of the ground isn't really going to amend the soil the way we want it to. But it does seem that tilling and compost can be still a benefit for loosening that soil up, and moving our properties of soil in the direction that we want them to be. So now I'm going to get into our second field experiment, and this is building off that first one. Again, our objective was to kind of determine the bulk density and infiltration rate of our compacted and our tilled plus compost treatments. So again, we have that simulated construction site. We had the tilled treatment where we tilled it to 12 inches. And then we had the till plus compost where we tilled the soil to 12 inches and incorporated compost at 25% by volume. What sets us apart from the first one is we divided the plots in half and had some that get additional traffic and some that didn't get additional traffic. The idea was if we implement this practice on a roadside, we know there's going to be regular mowing maintenance or occasional vehicle stops. And we are curious how these practices are going to hold up to additional compaction after we implement them. So part of our plots were mowed with a riding lawnmower, similar to what the DOT does on the road. The other parts we mowed with a string trimmer, so they didn't get any additional compaction. Here we're looking at the bulk density of the results with the grass cut with a string trimmer, so no additional compaction. We monitored this site for up to 26 months, so about 2 years worth of data, and I'll present the first data point and the last data point so we can get a range of how the practices work. At the 7-month mark, our compacted treatment had the highest bulk density, and once we tilled the soil, we got a significant reduction, and then in this case, the till plus compost had a further reduction in our bulk density. Over at the 26-month mark, we see the exact same trend where our till treatment is still significantly lower than our compacted treatment, and our till plus compost treatment is still significantly lower than our till treatment. So in this case, we can have tilling and compost that holds their structure for at least 2 years compared to our compacted treatment. Moving on to our infiltration rate in inches per hour. At that 7-month mark, we see that our compacted treatment has the lowest infiltration rate, while our tilled treatment has the same or significantly higher infiltration rate, but it's the same as our tilled plus compost. And we see the exact same thing again at that 26-month mark, where our compacted treatment is significantly lower than the tilled and the tilled plus compost. And again, this is with no additional compaction. I just kind of want to point out some of the numbers that we actually got for this infiltration study. So our compacted treatment is looking at about 1 inch or less of rain per hour, where once you till that soil, we can get to 10 to 11 inches of water per hour going into that soil. It's not often we get a rainstorm that is going to be 10 inches per hour, but this just shows that we can attenuate runoff volume coming from roads, so we can hold a higher volume than the rainfall typically. Now, what about the tire track infiltration or the grass cut with the riding lawnmower? So at the 7-month mark, the compacted treatment was still our lowest, while we had tilled being our middle treatment and our till plus compost, we got a significant increase in infiltration this time. Moving over to the 26-month mark, what we see is our compacted and our till treatment are actually statistically the same, while our till plus compost treatment is at significantly higher. So this is saying somehow our till treatment got recompacted by the riding lawnmower, but our compost treatment didn't. This is important to keep in mind because if we expect there to be regular mowing maintenance or occasional vehicle stops, we might want to consider compost as being able to hold up the infiltration rate for as long as we possibly can, and in this case, at least 2 years. So our next experiment was really looking at how much compost should we be recommending to the DOT. Compost can be an expense, so we want to make sure if we recommend compost, what is the right rate for the properties of soil that we're looking for. So here our treatments are our till treatment where we tilled the soil to 6 inches, and then we had till plus compost where we had 10, 30, and 50% compost by volume. And we were measuring our bulk density, infiltration rate, runoff volume, and biomass. I should note that our till depth here changed to 6 inches. So a study I'm not showing is we did a till study where we compared 6 inches to 12 inches, and we didn't find any differences in tilling the soil to 6 or 12 inches. So we would go with the 6 inches because it is a little bit easier and more cost effective to till the 6 inches versus 12 inches. We also monitored runoff volume for this. We were just curious how much water is actually running off of our practices. So for this, we had some wooden boards we hammered into the ground. We put them on a gentle slope for about 5% so that we could actually convey the water coming off of it into our PVC pipe and then collect it at our collection tank at the bottom and then figure out how much each practice is running off. So now I'm going to get into the results again, and we're going to start with our bulk density. Every time we add compost, we get a significant reduction in our bulk density. So it seems that we need a minimum of 10% compost in order to see that reduction in our bulk density. For our runoff volume, we didn't find any difference between 0% compost up to 30%, but we did see a significant reduction in our runoff volume with 50% compost. So it seems that we need at least 50% compost to reduce the runoff volume. But I should note that all our runoff volumes that we got were less than 10%, which is pretty good for most stormwater management practices. Now for infiltration rate, our 0% compost had the lowest infiltration rate at about 10 inches per hour. And we got a significant increase in that infiltration rate at 10% compost. And the 10 and the 30% compost were statistically the same. So it took then the 50% compost application to be significantly different. So at least a minimum of 10% compost to see a benefit in infiltration, and then you don't see that benefit again until you hit 50% compost. And I should note our 50% compost was infiltrating around 25 inches per hour, which is very, very fast. Last, we did biomass. And again, this is just to figure out how much grass cover is on there to make sure that we're getting a substantial grass cover. We found that at every rate of compost, you had a significant increase in vegetation. So this is showing us that compost is a nutrient source and that you do get better vegetation with the compost you put out. So some of the compost takeaways that we found are really that if you increase your compost rate, you can increase your biomass and you can increase your infiltration and you'll decrease your bulk density. We also found that compost may resist our tire track compaction, and this is good for regular mowing maintenance and occasional vehicle stops. We also found that if you're not going to have any additional traffic on the area, tilling is the #1 thing you can do to loosen up that soil to really increase your infiltration rates. So now I'm going to get into some of our wildflower experiments. So the objective of this was to determine our bulk density and infiltration rate and our root mass density of tilling and tilling plus compost with either grass or wildflowers. So in this case, we tilled the soil 6 inches, or we had till plus compost where we tilled the soil to 6 inches and incorporate compost at 25% by volume. Then we either planted grass or wildflowers on the plots. So this study was a very large study where we had 3 different sites across North Carolina that we monitored for 3 years. One of the reasons we chose 3 different locations in North Carolina is simply because the DOT already recommends different things based off the location in the state. So we were curious, if you're in the mountains versus the coastal plain, are you going to need a different recommendation? So our mountain site is going to be abbreviated MT, PD is for our Piedmont, and then CP will be our coastal plain site. And again, for this, we decided to break the plots in half and do some with additional traffic and some with no additional traffic to see how our wildflowers and compost hold up to that compaction. So in this case, we had a tractor with a lawnmower attachment that drove over the plots. And then the other part of the plots that had no additional traffic were mowed with a string trimmer. So this this picture was taken right after we mowed the plots in about October when the grass is starting to go dormant, and you can visually see where the tractor was mowing. This is important to keep in mind when you see the results, just because it is very highly visible in the dormant season where the tractor is mowing. For the pollinator seed mix, we went to a commercial vendor and we bought a Southeast specific mix. It had a blend of 17 different species. We had 9 annuals and 8 perennials in the mix. The one parameter that we decided to measure that we haven't talked about yet was root mass density. For this, we simply hammered into the ground a core that's about 1 foot long. We pull it out, we take it back to the lab, wash the soil off, and then we measure the amount of roots in that soil volume. One of the reasons we decided to do this was because people assume that once you plant wildflowers, your infiltration is going to increase because they have a deeper, more robust rooting system. So in order for us to say that they do indeed have higher infiltration due to their root mass, we have to measure the root mass and see if we're seeing differences in our root mass with wildflowers, grass. So now I'm going to get into our bulk density results with the grass cut with the string trimmer, so no additional traffic. Again, CP for coastal plain, PD for Piedmont, MT for mountain. Across the compost with and without, we see that all the time that you add compost, you get a significant reduction in your bulk density. It doesn't matter the location of the state. For vegetation, we didn't see any significant differences in our density of the soil with grass versus wildflowers. So this is indicating to us that compost is the source of the reduction in bulk density, not necessarily the vegetation that we planted. Here we are looking at some bar figures of our bulk density with the grass cut with the tractor. So on our x-axis, we have our treatments, and then our y-axis is our bulk density in PCF. The white colored bars are going to be no traffic, and the darker colored bars are going to be traffic. One thing to note is just once you have compaction in that system, you're going to have a higher bulk density. It doesn't matter what treatment you put out. But we did find is somehow once we had wildflowers or compost in the system, the increase in bulk density was just less compared to grass alone and then without compost. So again, we see this somehow compost is resisting tire track compaction, and also wildflowers somehow is resisting this tire track compaction. Moving on to the infiltration rate with the grass cut with a string trimmer, so no additional traffic. Looking at compost, we see that at the Piedmont and the mountain site, we did see a significant reduction in significant increase in infiltration with compost, but we didn't see a difference at our coastal plain site. So what we think is going on here is that our coastal plain soils are already very sandy and have high infiltration rates. So we might not get a benefit of infiltration rate in sandy soils. But once we move over to the mountain, the Piedmont region, where we have a more clay dominant soil, we might see that benefit for infiltration because clays just infiltrate less water. Moving down to the vegetation for grass versus wildflowers, across the state, we saw a significant increase in infiltration rate with wildflowers. This does show us that somehow if there's no additional traffic, wildflowers can increase your infiltration rate. But what about our grass cut with the tractor with that additional compaction? So again, on the x-axis, we have our treatments, and then we have our infiltration rate in centimeters per hour on the y-axis. The white bars are, again, no traffic, and the darker bars are traffic. Yet again, once we add traffic into the system, your infiltration rate is going to go down. It doesn't matter what you did to it. However, what we did find is somehow our wildflower treatments just had a less of a reduction in infiltration compared to our grass treatments. So somehow wildflowers are resisting that tire track compaction more than grass. Lastly, moving on to root mass density. So again, we chose to measure root mass density because we thought that wildflowers would have a deeper, more robust rooting system. For this data, we divided it into 3 different depths. So 0 to 3 inches, 3 to 6 inches, and then 6 to 12 inches. I'm only presenting a subset of the data, partly because our data was very boring. We didn't really find any differences in root mass between grass and wildflowers. So what we did find, which we thought was interesting, was that the top 3 inches of the soil had 60% of all the root mass, and then the top 6 inches of the soil had 90% of the root mass. Our till depth was 6 inches, so we are thinking that the roots are growing in the till depth because we tilled the soil to have a more favorable environment. Where we till the soil is also where we put fertilizer and lime, so that's also where the nutrients are. So we didn't see a difference in our rooting depth, but we did see a difference in the infiltration with wildflowers, but somehow it's not related to their root mass. Moving on to our last field experiment. This is building off the first one with wildflowers. Again, we were looking at tilled and tilled plus compost. And then we decided to mix up our vegetation cover and have grass and then wildflowers and then a mix of grass and wildflowers. The idea behind the mix was that we like grass because it grows really fast and we can get strong vegetation cover fast, but we also want wildflowers for their longer term benefits and aesthetic benefits. So we're curious if a mix couldn't get us the best of both worlds. Here for our till treatment, we again tilled to 6 inches, and then our till plus compost, we used 30% by volume. Here we're looking at our bulk density of the treatments, looking at compost versus no compost, where compost is going to be purple, no compost is going to be red. On the x-axis, we have the month-year, so we measured this for about 2 years, and then we have our bulk density and PCF on the y-axis. When we look at the purple bars, they are significantly lower, which is our compost, compared to our red bars for no compost. So again, this shows us that compost is significantly reducing our bulk density, and it's holding that up for at least 2 years. When we looked at bulk density again for our vegetation, we didn't find any significant differences, which was the same from our first study, where it seems that compost is the source of the change in density. Moving on to our infiltration rate, look for compost. So again, on our x-axis, we have our month-year, and then our y-axis is our infiltration rate in inches per hour. What we see here is our compost is significantly higher compared to no compost over the course of 2 years, yet again showing that compost can significantly increase your infiltration rate compared to no compost. However, this time we didn't see any differences in vegetation when we looked at grass, wildflowers, or grass plus wildflowers. Now moving on to vegetation. So a lot of the study was focused on measuring our vegetation cover. Part of this was an experiment of using drones to visually capture pictures of the vegetation so that the DOT can have an easy tool to monitor their vegetation, so that if they have miles of roadway corridor, they are required to monitor until they hit that 70% vegetation cover. They can easily do it with a drone, and then we would give them some kind of post-processing instructions. So this is really our first attempt at kind of easing their monitoring of roadway corridors for that 70% vegetation threshold. So on this graph, we have our years and months on the x-axis, and then our percent vegetation cover on the x-axis. The red dotted line is that 70% vegetation threshold before the DOT can stop monitoring it. The purple line is compost, and that took about 2 to 3 months to hit that 70% vegetation threshold, while no compost took about 3 to 4 months to hit that same threshold. Throughout the first year of vegetation cover, compost was the clear winner in terms of having the more cover, but after 1 year, those differences were we couldn't tell the difference between compost and no compost. So it does seem that within the first year, you do get a benefit from adding compost into your system. Moving on to the different vegetation mixes we had. Again, we have our month and years on the x-axis and our vegetation cover on the y-axis. Here, the red line is going to be grass, the purple line is wildflowers, and then our green line is grass and wildflowers. All treatments took about 3 to 4 months to hit that 70% vegetation threshold. And throughout the monitoring period, there was no real difference in vegetation cover between the different vegetation we planted. So if you want to use a grass wildflower mix, or you want to put wildflowers out, you can get the same vegetation cover as grass, and that does last for at least 2 years. Moving on to root mass density. So again, with wildflowers, we were curious if we saw any differences in our root mass. We broke our data up into our topsoil, which is where we tilled. So that's the 0 to 6 inches. And then our subsoil, which is our 0 to 16 inches. And then we totaled it for the total root mass of the soil profile. So on the x-axis, we were looking at compost versus no compost. And on our y-axis, we have our total root mass. So we didn't find any differences in our root mass in the subsoil, but we did find that compost does have significantly higher root mass in the tilled portion. And then when you sum that to be the total measurement sample depth of 0 to 16 inches, we do find that compost supports a more robust root mass system. We didn't find any differences in root mass again between vegetation types. We still find that when you look at grass versus wildflowers, most of that root mass is going to be in the till depth. However, we do find differences in our root mass with or without compost. So long-term, if we're trying to think about stabilizing the soil, roots are going to be the long-term solution for that. So we might want to think about adding compost into the system to help really stabilize those soils. So what are some takeaways from the wildflower treatments that we found? The first is most of our root mass is going to be in the till depth. So unfortunately, we don't see the root mass being the reason why we see better infiltration with wildflowers. It's for some other reason. We also found that wildflowers have the same infiltration to grass and also the same cover, so you can use them if you would like. An interesting finding that we had is across all 3 different locations in North Carolina, we consistently had 4 out of our 17 species of the wildflower mix bloom over our monitoring period. That was our lance leaf, coreopsis, cosmos, California poppy, and blanket flower. So you can use a more targeted wildflower mix of those 4 species that seem to be very adapt to all different geographic regions of North Carolina. And then what are some takeaways when we think about compost and wildflowers together? It seems that compost and wildflowers somehow resist that tire tract compaction, which is good for a stormwater management practice where you're going to want your infiltration rates to be as high as long as possible. It's also good because you're expecting occasional vehicle stops and regular mowing maintenance. We found that grass plus wildflowers did maintain that 70% vegetation threshold for at least 2 years. So again, if you want to choose an alternative vegetation, you can. So one of the reasons we think that wildflowers perform better in terms of infiltration and just not being compacted as much is simply because of the recommended DOT mowing patterns between them. The DOT recommends that you mow wildflowers once per year and you mow your grass 4 times per year. So that's what we did. And we think simply because we mowed wildflowers once, it just gets less compaction over the year compared to 4 mowings. This is important to keep in mind simply because if you want to use wildflowers, it is lower maintenance. You are mowing it once, but also because you're just putting less compaction out there, you're keeping your treatment at the soil properties the way you want them for a longer period of time. So here are some kind of conclusions that we've been giving the DOT for their soil best management practices. The first is compost incorporation can be used to improve stormwater management for at least 3 years. So if you're looking to attenuate extra runoff from roadways, compost seems to be a viable option. Also, if you have wildflowers out there, they do have higher infiltration than grass, and it's not related to our root mass density. It seems to be more related to the fact that we mow wildflowers once versus 4 times per year. Also, compost and wildflowers resist that tire tract compaction, which is good for our regular mowing maintenance and vehicle stops. And also, if we want to use a wildflower mix, we can focus on a few key species to make the recommendations across the state easy versus having targeted wildflower blends for each region of the state. So I want to bring it back to the larger picture out there. So from 2024 to 2033, the DOT has over 5,000 miles of roadway projects planned, which means they have a lot of roadway vegetation that they're going to have to manage when that construction ends. So what we are hoping to do is have the practices that we give the DOT make their work a little bit easier when they're done with their construction, and that they're able to get their vegetation planted and grown, but they're also able to infiltrate the excess stormwater coming off of the roadways. I'm just going to briefly talk about some other interesting DOT projects we have. One is about track out prevention. So if you've ever been to a construction site, you know that they're required to have a gravel entrance or exit pad to prevent mud on the road. The number one complaint the DOT gets is actually because tires track mud out onto the roadway, and people who live there don't like it, or it creates hazards to roadways when it's wet. So the DOT was interested in seeing if their recommendation of the stone exit pad was the best practice out there. So we bought 2 different manufactured devices, the FODs and the rubber form, and we're comparing them to the standard gravel exit entrance pad to see if we can't get better mud removal with these manufactured products. So how we did this is we actually bought a tire and we cut it up and we put some mud on it, and then we would strap it onto our tire, and then we'd drive it over the practice and we would measure how much mud was still left on. We went around the state, we collected different textures that we found on construction sites. We also chose different moisture contents between the liquid and the plastic limit to get a variety of textures and moisture contents that we would see on a construction site. The next project we have with them is using sediment basins to separate diamond grinding slurry. So when you do diamond grinding on a highway, there's a waste product that goes along with it. And right now it's very expensive for the DOT to dispose of that. They actually take it to a press plate system to divide the solids and liquids, and then they have to dispose of it at a special facility because the pH is so high, it's considered a toxic material. So they were curious if we couldn't use a sediment basin to use that same settling mechanics to separate the diamond grinding slurry. So we are working with one of the DOT contractors on a sediment basin here to see how well we can actually separate that water and that solid and potentially recycle that water on the diamond grinding projects to make it more environmentally friendly and also effective with water. We are also looking at what we can do with the solid from the diamond grinding slurry. So the pH of it is actually similar to the pH of lime. And so we were curious if we couldn't use it as a fill material or some kind of lime alternative on construction sites. And I just want to thank the DOT for their sponsor of all the projects. Also want to thank the lab techs, Adam, Jamie, and Chris, who all help with the day-to-day operations of the stuff you've heard about today. And then we also had our fabulous graduate students who helped with the work. So Shadi, Mafus, Fatima, and Virginia. This work wouldn't have been possible without them. And with that, I'd like to open up to any questions you may have. So typically in the Piedmont, the recommended by the DOT is, I believe, centipede and Bermuda. Yeah, so it depends. So if you're planting in the spring versus the fall, they have a different recommended mix. So I need to, yeah.
Has NCDOT implemented any of your recommendations yet? I know maybe they're still considering options, but have you heard anything on that front yet?
So they are currently rewriting their soil best management practice manual, and I know we gave them some material for their compost section. I don't know where that currently is. They've had some, I'd say, some tricky slopes where we've gone out and we've put out some plots ourselves for compost and vegetation, and we've had success, but nothing more than what we're putting out. Yes.
Lots of you could place the other under the
Yes.
that's pretty best.
So the idea of, I guess not the idea, the benefit of having that high infiltration rate is if you're going to have excess water coming off the roadway, you're going to have a higher volume than the rain. So we want it to have a high infiltration rate to have that extra volume so we don't get pooling next to roadsides, or if we do get runoff, it's not going to overwhelm our built stormwater structures that aren't necessarily built for the runoff volumes we're now seeing. So right now we're generally recommending about 30%. We do have future research to kind of look at it on slopes, because right now when we put it out on DOT slopes, they're not steep. Like, we're not putting this out on a 2-to-1 slope, partly because if you put compost out, it would probably just slide down if we got too much rain. So now we're trying to figure out what kind of angle we can actually put it on for it to be effective. Yes.
So all the however, go back out, plow it all up again, start over. Is there any advance If you think about what happens down the road.
So we've thought about this a little bit, and what we think might happen is kind of based off of what we've seen in agricultural studies. So once you put compost out there and it does decay and it's not there anymore, we're hoping that we have a really good rooting system to keep that soil at a lower density, because once you have a robust rooting system, unless you're going in and manually compacting it, it generally can hold its density for a long period of time. So we were hoping that if on these roadside environments where we don't get too much traffic, it might resemble something like that.
You mentioned. Because plastic will in. Well, mainly. I know plastic is better than.
Okay.
But plastic will in.
So I have to say, I'm not 100% sure on the full definition. Someone here might know it better than me. But when we work with our soils between the liquid and the plastic limit, the liquid limit is something closer to shortly after it's been raining. And then the plastic limit is something resembling more of a drier soil, like a dry pottery clay that's going to break in your hands type of texture.
Like, so the water content, which it exhibits more like property versus the more plastic, like respond property to stresses.
Definition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any questions on the Zoom?
All right.
Thank you.